The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah adjusted her stethoscope around her neck. St. Mary's Hospital had seen better days, the psychiatric wing especially. Built in 1892, the building retained its original Victorian architecture, complete with long, echoing corridors and rooms that seemed to breathe with their own malevolent life. Sarah had been working the night shift for 3 months now, and the isolation was getting to her. The psychiatric ward housed only 12 patients, most of whom slept soundly through her rounds. But lately, something felt different. Wrong. It started with room 237. The room had been empty for weeks since Mrs. Henderson passed away. The elderly woman had been admitted for severe dementia, often screaming about the children in the walls. The staff dismissed her ravings as symptoms of her deteriorating mind. But after her death, nurses reported hearing faint scratching sounds coming from the room. Tonight, Sarah decided to investigate. At 2:17 a.m., she approached room 237 with her flashlight, despite the hallway lights being functional. The door stood slightly ajar, odd, since maintenance always ensured empty rooms were properly secured. She pushed it open, wincing at the prolonged creak. The room was exactly as it should be, empty bed, bare walls, single window overlooking the courtyard. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost viscous, and carried a strange metallic taste. That's when she heard it. Scratch. 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 The sound came from inside the walls, rhythmic and deliberate. Sarah pressed her ear against the faded wallpaper. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling foolish. The scratching stopped. Sarah waited, heart pounding, but silence prevailed. She was about to leave when she noticed something that made her blood freeze. On the wall where she'd been listening, the old wallpaper was peeling away in thin strips, revealing dark wood underneath. But that wasn't what terrified her. Carved into the wood, in crude, desperate letters, were words, "Help US." They put US in the walls. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind, "The children in the walls." She'd always assumed it was dementia-induced paranoia, but what if? She forced herself to examine the wall more closely. The scratches were fresh, wood shavings littered the floor. Someone, or something, had been clawing at this wall recently. But that was impossible. The room had been empty for weeks. Sarah's radio crackled to life, making her jump. "Sarah, this is dispatch. We need you in room 203. Patient is having an episode." As she turned to leave, she heard it again, not just scratching now, but whispers. Soft, childlike voices emanating from within the walls, pleading, crying. She pressed her hands to her ears and ran. The next morning, Sarah researched the hospital's history. What she found chilled her to the bone. In 1923, St. Mary's had housed an orphanage in its basement levels. A fire had swept through the building, trapping 37 children in the lower levels. The official report stated that all bodies were recovered and properly buried. But Sarah found discrepancies in the records. Inconsistent body counts. Testimonies from survivors mentioning children who simply vanished during the chaos. And most disturbing of all, renovation records from 1924 showing extensive wall reconstruction, work that began immediately after the fire. That night, Sarah couldn't concentrate on her rounds. Every creak, every shadow seemed menacing. She avoided room 237 entirely, but at 3:33 a.m., she heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it wasn't coming from just one room. The sound echoed throughout the entire psychiatric wing, as if something was moving through the walls themselves. Other patients began to stir, some crying out in their sleep, others pressing themselves against their doors as if trying to escape. Sarah followed the sound, her flashlight beam trembling. The scratching led her to the basement access door, a heavy steel barrier that had been locked for years due to structural concerns. But tonight, it stood wide open, revealing a staircase descending into absolute darkness. The metallic taste in the air was overwhelming now, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Sarah knew she should call for backup, should radio the security guard, should do anything except what she was about to do. She descended the stairs. The basement was a maze of abandoned rooms and corridors, much larger than the hospital's current blueprints indicated. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and her footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. The scratching was louder here, accompanied by those same childlike whispers. But now she could make out words, "Cold, so cold, let us out, please." Sarah's flashlight illuminated a corridor lined with small doors, rooms that looked exactly like the children's dormitories described in the historical records. But something was wrong with the walls. They were newer than the rest of the structure, hastily constructed with mismatched materials. In the final room, Sarah found the truth. The walls showed signs of recent disturbance, loose bricks, fresh mortar, and protruding from a gap near the floor, a small human hand, desiccated but unmistakably real. The scratching sounds weren't coming through the walls. They were coming from within them. As the horrible realization sank in, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see the security guard, flashlight in hand, his face grim but unsurprised. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said quietly. "The children," Sarah whispered. "They're still, they're in the walls." The guard nodded slowly. "Some secrets should stay buried." Sarah backed away, understanding flooding through her. "You knew. You all knew. The night staff learns eventually. We have a choice to make. Keep the secret, or..." He gestured toward the walls. "Well, there's always room for one more." As Sarah ran for the stairs, the scratching intensified, joined by dozens of small voices pleading for help. But by morning, just like every other night shift worker before her, she had made her choice. The secret would remain buried. And in room 237, the scratching continued. The rusty key felt cold against Marcus's palm as he stood before the Victorian mansion that had belonged to his great-aunt Millicent. He'd never met her. The family had whispered about her eccentricities and her self-imposed isolation for decades. But now she was dead, and somehow, he'd inherited her estate. The house loomed against the gray October sky, its gabled roof and ornate trim giving it the appearance of something from a Gothic novel. Paint peeled from its sides like diseased skin, and several windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. Marcus had driven 3 hours from the city to assess the property. His initial plan was simple: spend a day cataloging anything valuable, then put the place on the market. He certainly hadn't expected to find himself standing before what looked like a set piece from a horror movie. The front door opened with surprising ease, though the hinges protested with a prolonged shriek. Inside, dust particles danced in the afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The air smelled of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Marcus's stomach turn. The house was a maze of rooms filled with antique furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in time. But it was the photographs that caught his attention. Hundreds of them, covering every available wall surface. All were portraits of the same woman at different ages, a severe-looking person with dark eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved through the rooms. Aunt Millicent, he assumed. In the parlor, Marcus found a leather-bound journal lying open on an ornate writing desk. The final entry was dated just 1 week ago. "They're getting stronger. I can hear them moving at night, scratching at the walls of their prison. The binding spell is weakening after all these years. I'm too old now, too tired to maintain it much longer. God forgive me for what I'm about to do, but someone else must take responsibility. The blood must continue the line, or they will be free to roam the world again." Marcus frowned. Aunt Millicent had clearly been suffering from some form of mental illness in her final days. He photographed the journal entry with his phone. It might be important for insurance or legal purposes, then continued his exploration. The second floor contained 6 bedrooms, each more deteriorated than the last. But it was the master bedroom that made Marcus pause. The entire room was covered in symbols, painted, carved, and etched into every surface. Strange geometric patterns, occult-looking diagrams, and what appeared to be Latin text covered the walls, ceiling, and even the floorboards. At the center of the room sat an enormous mirror, easily 8 feet tall and framed in tarnished silver. But the reflection was wrong. Marcus could see himself clearly, but behind his reflection, the room appeared different. Older, somehow, with furniture and decorations that weren't actually there. As he approached the mirror, his reflection suddenly moved independently, tilting its head and smiling while Marcus remained perfectly still. He stumbled backward, heart racing. Trick of the light, he told himself. Old mirrors often had imperfections that created optical illusions. But as he watched, his reflection began to mouth words, its face contorting with apparent urgency. "Don't let them out." Marcus fled the room, but not before noticing that every symbol painted on the walls seemed to point toward the mirror like arrows. Downstairs, he tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Stress from work, the long drive, the eerie atmosphere of the house, all perfectly reasonable explanations for a momentary hallucination. He decided to check the basement and then leave. The house could wait for professional appraisers. The basement door was reinforced with multiple locks and chains, but Marcus found the keys hanging on a nearby hook. Someone, Millicent, presumably, had wanted access but also wanted to ensure the basement remained secure. The stairs creaked ominously as he descended into darkness. His phone's flashlight revealed a basement unlike anything he'd expected. The space was vast, stretching beyond the house's apparent foundation, and the walls were lined with the same symbols he'd seen upstairs. But it was the mirrors that made his blood run cold. Dozens of them, all different sizes and styles, arranged in a perfect circle around the basement's perimeter. And in each one, Marcus could see movement, figures that weren't his own reflection, pressing against the glass as if trying to push through from the other side. In the center of the circle stood a pedestal holding an ancient-looking book. Marcus approached cautiously, noting that the air grew colder with each step. The book was written in Latin, but he could make out certain phrases: binding of souls, prison of glass, eternal reflection. As he read, the figures in the mirrors became more agitated, their movements more violent. And slowly, Marcus began to understand the horrible truth. His great-aunt hadn't been mentally ill. She'd been a guardian, maintaining a prison that held something unspeakably evil. The mirrors weren't reflecting, they were containing. And the binding spell that kept them trapped was indeed weakening. The book detailed the family's responsibility, passed down through generations. One member of each generation was chosen to maintain the binding, to keep the entities trapped within their glass prison. Millicent had been the guardian for over 60 years, but now she was dead, and the responsibility had fallen to him. Marcus tried to leave, but the basement door slammed shut above him. The lights flickered and died, leaving only his phone's fading battery. In the mirror light reflecting off the glass surfaces, he could see the trapped figures more clearly now. They weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their faces twisted into expressions of eternal hunger. And they were looking directly at him. One by one, the mirrors began to crack. Marcus grabbed the book and began reading the binding ritual, his voice shaking as he spoke the Latin words he didn't understand. The cracks in the mirrors spread faster, and the entities pressed harder against their glass prisons. But as he read, Marcus realized the terrible price of the binding. It required a guardian to remain, to feed their own life force into maintaining the prison. Millicent had spent 60 years slowly dying to keep these things contained. And now it was his turn. The first mirror shattered completely. A hand, impossibly long and ending in razor-sharp claws, reached through the empty frame. Marcus screamed and continued reading, feeling his own life energy being drawn into the spell. One by one, he managed to reseal the mirrors, but each one cost him years of his life. He could feel himself aging, his hair graying, his bones growing brittle. But the alternative was unthinkable, these entities loose in the world, feeding on human suffering. When the final mirror was sealed, Marcus collapsed to the floor, exhausted and decades older than he'd been an hour ago. He understood now why Millicent had isolated herself, why the family had whispered about her strangeness. The weight of the secret, the constant vigilance required, the slow sacrifice of one's own life, it was a burden that changed a person fundamentally. Marcus climbed the stairs on unsteady legs and made his way to the master bedroom. In the large mirror, his reflection showed his true age now, an old man with haunted eyes, just like Millicent in all those photographs. He picked up her journal and began to write. The binding holds for now, but I can feel it weakening. I estimate I have perhaps 30 years before I'll need to find my replacement. The next generation must be prepared for what's coming. The mirrors must never break, no matter the cost. Outside, Marcus's rental car sat empty. Inside the house, a new guardian had taken his post, just as his great-aunt had done decades before, and her great-uncle before her. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. And in the basement, the entities waited with endless patience, knowing that eventually, all guardians grew old and died. Eventually, the mirrors would break. David Chen had always prided himself on his rationality. As a forensic photographer for the Portland Police Department, he dealt in facts, evidence, and harsh realities. The supernatural was for movies and gullible people who believed in ghost stories. That changed the night he was called to photograph the Blackwood murder scene. The Victorian house on Elm Street had been the site of a triple homicide, a family found dead in their living room, positioned as if they'd been sitting for a formal portrait. The killer had never been found, and the case had gone cold 6 months ago. But now the house was being sold, and the department needed updated crime scene photos for their files. David arrived at 11 p.m., his equipment bag heavy with cameras, lights, and measuring tools. The house had been empty since the murders, and the realtor had left it unlocked for him. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he made his way to the living room where the Blackwood family had died. The room had been cleaned since the initial investigation, but David could still sense the weight of what had happened here. 3 chalk outlines remained on the hardwood floor, 2 adult figures and 1 small one. The child had been only 7 years old. David set up his camera equipment methodically, adjusting lights and angles to capture every detail. This was routine work, but something felt different tonight. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive, and his camera kept malfunctioning. The LCD screen flickered randomly, and the autofocus couldn't seem to lock onto anything properly. He switched to manual settings and began shooting. Through his viewfinder, the empty room looked normal, but when he reviewed the images on his camera screen, something was wrong. In the corner of each photo, barely visible, were shadowy figures that shouldn't have been there. David checked his equipment. No obvious problems. He cleaned his lens and tried again, but the shadows persisted. If anything, they seemed clearer now, more defined. 3 figures, 2 adults and a child, standing exactly where the chalk outlines marked their deaths. This had to be some kind of equipment malfunction. David had been working crime scenes for 12 years and had never encountered anything he couldn't explain rationally. But as he continued shooting, the figures in his photos became increasingly clear. They were the Blackwood family. David recognized them from the case files. Thomas Blackwood, 34, wearing the same blue shirt he'd died in. His wife Patricia, 31, her blonde hair arranged exactly as it had been found. And little Emma, 7, still wearing her school uniform. But they weren't just appearing in his photos, they were posing. Each image showed them in slightly different positions, as if they were aware of being photographed and were trying to communicate something. In one shot, Thomas pointed toward the fireplace. In another, Patricia gestured frantically toward the kitchen. Little Emma, in every photo, seemed to be crying. David's hands were shaking now. This was impossible. Cameras didn't capture ghosts, they captured light reflecting off physical objects. But the evidence was undeniable. His professional-grade equipment was documenting something that shouldn't exist. He decided to try an experiment. Instead of random shots, he would take deliberate portraits, treating the invisible family as if they were posing subjects. "If you can hear me," he said to the empty room, feeling foolish, "I want to help. Show me what you need me to see." David looked through his viewfinder and carefully composed a shot of where Thomas appeared to be standing. He took the photo and immediately checked the LCD screen. Thomas was looking directly at the camera now, his mouth open as if speaking. Behind him, the wall showed something that wasn't visible to David's naked eye: writing, scratched into the paint in desperate, uneven letters. David adjusted his position and took another shot, this time focusing on where the writing appeared to be. When he reviewed the image, he could clearly read the message. "Basement. Killer still here. Help US." David's blood ran cold. According to the case files, the basement had been thoroughly searched. Nothing had been found except old storage items and a furnace. But the family was pointing him towards something the living investigators had missed. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, David gathered his equipment and made his way to the basement door. It was unlocked, though he didn't remember the realtor mentioning basement access. The stairs were narrow and steep, creaking under his weight. David's camera flash illuminated the descent in stark bursts of light. At the bottom, he found himself in a typical unfinished basement: concrete walls, exposed beams, and the musty smell of dampness. But his camera saw something different. Through the viewfinder, David could see the ghost family standing near the far wall, all three pointing at what appeared to be solid concrete. He took several shots, and each one revealed more detail. The wall wasn't solid, it was newer construction, hastily built to conceal something behind it. David approached the wall and examined it closely. To his naked eyes, it looked normal, but his camera revealed the truth. Fresh mortar, different concrete composition, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be scratches on the interior surface, as if someone had been clawing at it from the inside. He used his phone to call Detective Morrison, who had worked the original case. "Morrison here. It's David Chen. I'm at the Blackwood house taking photos, and I think I've found something." At 11:30 at night. "Dave, couldn't this wait until morning? There's a false wall in the basement. I think someone might be concealed behind it." David could hear Morrison's skepticism through the phone. "Dave, we searched that basement thoroughly. There's nothing there. I'm looking at evidence that suggests otherwise. The wall composition is different, and there are signs of recent construction." Morrison sighed. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't do anything stupid." David hung up and continued photographing. The ghost family had moved closer now, their expressions urgent. Little Emma seemed to be pointing not at the wall, but behind David. He spun around, camera raised, and took a shot of the basement stairs. The photo revealed a fourth figure, a man David didn't recognize, standing at the top of the stairs. Very much alive. Very much real. And holding what appeared to be a crowbar. David's flash had given away his position. The man began descending the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the concrete space. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice calm but menacing. "Especially not tonight." David backed toward the false wall, his mind racing. This had to be the killer, someone who had been using the empty house as a hiding place, someone who knew about the concealed space behind the basement wall. "The police are on their way," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man laughed. "No, they're not. I heard your phone call. 20 minutes, you said. That's more than enough time." David raised his camera and fired the flash directly at the man's face, temporarily blinding him. In that moment of confusion, he grabbed a piece of broken concrete and smashed it against the false wall. The concrete cracked, revealing a hollow space behind it. And from that space came a sound that would haunt David for the rest of his life, a weak, barely human voice calling for help. Someone was alive back there. Someone had been trapped behind that wall, possibly for months. The killer recovered from the flash and lunged at David with the crowbar, but the ghost family intervened in the only way they could. David's camera began firing on its own, the flash strobing wildly, creating a disorienting light show that sent the killer stumbling backward. David continued smashing at the wall until he'd created a hole large enough to reach through. His fingers found fabric, then skin. Someone was indeed trapped inside, barely alive but breathing. Morrison's voice echoed from upstairs, "Dave? You down there?" "Basement," David shouted. "I've got the killer down here, and there's a survivor trapped behind the wall." The killer tried to run, but Morrison was already on the stairs, gun drawn. The arrest was swift and decisive. Later, as EMTs worked to free the survivor, a homeless man who had been missing for 4 months, Morrison pulled David aside. David looked at his camera, scrolling through the photos he'd taken. In every image now, the basement appeared normal. No ghost family, no messages, no evidence of the supernatural encounter that had led him to the truth. "Just lucky, I guess," David said. But as he packed up his equipment, David took one final photo of the empty living room. In that last image, barely visible but unmistakably present, were 3 figures, no longer desperate or urgent, but peaceful. The Blackwood family, finally at rest, having guided him to save a life and capture their killer. Thomas Blackwood raised his hand in what appeared to be a gesture of thanks. Patricia smiled sadly. And little Emma, for the first time in any of the photos, wasn't crying. David saved the image and then deleted it. Some things were meant to remain between the dead and those